Ever feel like both sides of the political aisle are just peddling different flavors of crazy?
Mm-hmm.
We'll get this one. Writer compares liberals to heroin addicts and conservatives to cokeheads.
Wow.
And the crazy part,
Yeah.
he might actually have a point.
Mm.
We're diving into a blog post called Heroin Liberals and Cocaine Conservatives today.
Okay.
Buckle up.
Sounds like a wild ride.
So what's fascinating about this, I think, is that it's not just like a catchy title, right?
Right.
It gets at something very real about how today's political movements operate, especially when it comes to fundraising.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not some, ivory tower academic we're talking about here.
Right.
This is Gray Mirror writing over on Substack.
Right.
Who, calls himself a reactionary, so that kind of gives you a taste of his style. Not afraid to ruffle some feathers.
No, he's definitely not.
And his big idea here is that each side, politically, is hooked on its own brand of, well, he would say, political drug, each feeding off different desires, different anxieties.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. First up, liberals and their heroin. He calls it the blue pill, right? That blissful ignorance that lets you ignore all the problems of the world as long as you feel like you're on the right side of history.
It's like he's saying Democrats have become masters at making donors feel good about themselves, feel good about their contributions, even if those donations don't actually translate into effective policies or real change on the ground.
And he uses the left's massive funding advantage, particularly among nonprofits, as evidence of this.
Right? It's like they figured out how to tap into this deep human need to feel good about your politics, even if those good feelings aren't backed up by any real results.
And then on the other side, you've got conservatives hooked on their cocaine, that short-term high, that quick hit of outrage, of activism.
And Chris Rufo, the guy waging war on woke ideology, he's a prime example of this.
Okay, yeah.
The author saying Rufo represents this in-your-face cocaine conservatism, all about the fiery rhetoric, the symbolic victories like, taking on Harvard. But ultimately, it relies on a fantasy.
Because you can't just recapture a place like Harvard with a few clever arguments or, snappy hashtags, right?
Exactly.
Like Rufo himself put it, you have to win back language. But I think what this author is saying, it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, he's saying institutions themselves are often the problem, not just the ideas they're promoting, right? So simply changing the messaging, like winning the argument, it's not enough. He says you'd need to build entirely new structures operating on fundamentally different principles.
Which, let's be honest, that's a much taller order than just trying to tweak what's already there.
For sure.
It's like trying to build a car from scratch instead of just changing the tires,
A much bigger project.
And that's where his critique of the right gets really interesting, I think, because he argues that conservatives are so busy battling woke culture and the deep state that they haven't fully grasped the need for a compelling alternative.
It's not enough to tear down the old. You have to build up something new and better in its place.
So what does that even look like?
That's the million-dollar question. Yeah. And that's what we're going to unpack as we go.
It's almost like he's saying both sides are stuck in this political hamster wheel, right? Addicted to the drama, but not actually getting anywhere.
Yeah. And it's interesting because he really hones in on that idea of addiction. Like both sides are more interested in maintaining that feeling of being on the right side, of being part of a winning team, than they are in actually changing the game.
Right.
And that's where that whole drug analogy becomes super powerful, right? It highlights how these narratives, they tap into our deepest desires, our anxieties, our need to feel safe, to feel righteous, to feel powerful, all of that.
And it's not just politicians, right? He's saying everyday people, even well-meaning donors, get sucked into this game.
Oh, absolutely.
They crave that sense of being a part of something bigger, even if it's all just an illusion.
Yeah, and he uses this really striking analogy to kind of illustrate this point. Imagine you're trying to attract someone's attention, maybe someone you're romantically interested in. Often, he argues, the best approach is actually to ignore them, right?
Oh.
Not to shower them with attention.
Yeah, interesting.
It creates this sense of mystery, of intrigue,
Okay, I see where he's going with this.
Yeah.
So instead of conservatives constantly attacking institutions like Harvard, trying to win them back, he's saying they should be building their own, even better alternatives.
Exactly.
Basically make the old guard irrelevant by creating something way more attractive, more trustworthy.
Precisely. It's about shifting that focus from tearing down the old to building up the new.
Which is a fascinating idea, but it kind of begs the question, Is that even possible in today's world?
Yeah.
You know, these institutions, they have so much power, so much money, so much influence.
And that's where I think his critique of like traditional conservative thinking gets really interesting. He's basically saying, look, this obsession with limited government, with individual liberty, those are 20th century solutions to 21st century problems.
Because you can't really have limited government when you have these massive institutions calling the shots, right?
Right. He's arguing that conservatives need a new playbook, one that recognizes the reality of how power actually operates today. And that new playbook, he suggests, well, it involves creating a new kind of elite. He calls it a faction of truth.
A faction of truth. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. What does that even mean? Is he talking about, like, I don't know, a political party or like a think tank?
It's a little more nuanced than that. He sees this faction of truth as a group of influential cultural figures, right? So we're talking writers, artists, thinkers, people like that. People who can challenge that dominant narrative and offer a genuinely compelling alternative.
So it's less about winning elections and more about winning, like, hearts and minds, shaping a whole new cultural landscape where these alternative institutions can actually thrive.
Exactly. He's arguing that lasting change requires more than just policy tweaks or political victories, right? It requires a fundamental shift in how we see the world. And he believes that artists and writers, they're kind of uniquely positioned to drive that kind of transformation.
But how do you even begin to create this faction of truth? And what kind of new institutions are we even talking about? Like, give me something concrete here.
Well, he's a little light on specifics, to be honest. But he does drop some intriguing hints. Like, for example, he talks about the need for like a new kind of university.
Okay, interesting.
One that's not beholden to corporate interests or ideological agendas, but is truly committed to the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth.
Okay, yeah, now that's an idea I can get behind. Imagine a university that was actually about education and not indoctrination.
Right.
But, I mean, isn't that a little idealistic? Like, who's going to fund this utopian institution?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Right.
And this is where his critique of both heroin liberals and cocaine conservatives kind of comes full circle. He argues that part of the problem is that both sides are so reliant on these existing sources of funding, sources that are often tied to the very narratives they're trying to escape.
So if you're constantly chasing after donations from people who are hooked on feeling good or hooked on feeling angry, you're never going to be able to build something truly different.
Right.
You're always going to be beholden to those agendas, those desires.
Precisely. And that's why he believes this faction of truth, this new elite, needs to be independent financially and intellectually for the existing power structures.
So we're talking about like a total paradigm shift here.
Yeah.
Not just like tweaking the system, but like building a whole new one from the ground up. It's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah. But then again, so is this whole heroin liberals, cocaine conservatives thing.
Right.
And, you know, the more we unpack it, the more it makes a weird kind of sense.
It's like he's challenging us to look beyond the surface, right? Beyond those kind of addictive narratives that keep us glued to our phones, glued to our political tribes, and saying like, what if real change requires us to break free from those addictions, to actually start thinking and acting in fundamentally different ways?
And maybe the first step is just recognizing those addictions, right? Like, do we actually care about solving problems? Or are we just hooked on the feeling of being part of the fight? It makes you wonder if all this political back and forth, all this outrage, all this activism is actually just a distraction from the real work that needs to be done. And that work, as the author suggests, might involve building something new, something that doesn't yet exist. A university that values truth above ideology, a media that prioritizes facts over clicks, a political system that's driven by principles and not just, you know, this constant drive for power. It's a tall order, but then again, so is breaking any addiction.
This whole conversation kind of reminds me of that old saying, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem.
Right.
Maybe it's time to stop feeding these addictive narratives, these political sugar rushes, and start investing our energy in something more meaningful, something that could actually make a difference.
It's a provocative thought, and one that I suspect will kind of stay with us long after this deep dive is over. It challenges us to really examine our own relationship to politics, to ask ourselves, what are we truly seeking in our engagement with these issues? Are we after real solutions, or are we just chasing a fleeting sense of, I don't know, belonging, righteousness, outrage?
Yeah, big questions to ponder, no doubt. But hey, That's what these deep dives are all about, right? Getting us to think differently, to challenge our assumptions, and maybe, just maybe, to imagine a better way forward.
And who knows, right? Maybe somewhere out there, a new generation of thinkers, creators, builders are already laying the groundwork for that better future. A future where the narratives of addiction are replaced by, the hard work and the even greater rewards, I think, of real change.
That's a hopeful thought to end on. So until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. Ever feel like